Hello everyone, this is Kat and welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. Today I'll be reading a one-shot entitled Third Degree. Here's the summary. A blast of cold air whips past his left ear, frost clinging to his cheek from just how close it is. Izuku's heart leaps and he jerks his head away, already craning his neck to look toward the source. "Careful, Todoroki," he says with a breathless laugh, eyes a little wide. Or a routine hero-in-training patrol goes wrong, and Izuku's caught in the crossfire. "Midoriya, on your left!" Todoroki's yell barely reaches Izuku's ears, barely manages to cut through the cacophony of sound ringing from every direction, but it does. Izuku pockets his phone and leaps to the side in one fluid motion, wincing as a blade slices through the air where he'd just been standing. He quickly pivots to face the villain, who he hadn't even noticed before, dropping into a defensive crouch as green lightning crackles up his legs. The villain flings a second knife at him, and Izuku darts out of the way, never taking his eyes off the enemy. The villain's eyes are wild, frenzied, teeth bared in a snarl that could rival one of Kachan's. "Stop moving, you goddamn brat!" The villain screams, jerking their hands sharply, and suddenly the knives they'd thrown are flying back into their open palms. They waste no time, left arm reeling back to throw. But Izuku has fought against the League of Villains. He's fought Stain, the hero killer, and this villain in comparison. This villain is slow. He dodges the first knife as it wheezes past his shoulder, then ducks under the second. A vein bulges in the villain's forehead, their face turning an alarming shade of maroon. "You fucking..." Izuku rushes them, hands coming up and grabbing at the villain's arms to prevent them from calling the knives back, but he's just a half a second too late. One of the knives whistles through the air, and the sound is all the warning Izuku gets before it flies past his arm and into the villain's waiting hand, slicing a long gash along Izuku's bicep. Sharp, stinging pain registers, but Izuku pays it no mind as he grabs the villain's wrist and wrenches the knife away, right hand balling into a fist and delivering a swift punch to the villain's stomach. The villain is thrown backwards from the force of the blow, their backs smacking against the side of the warehouse before they crumple into a motionless heap on the ground. Still, Izuku kicks the knives away from them, rolling his shoulders and bringing his focus back onto the fight. 1 down, 3 to go, he thinks grimly, gaze darting toward the bright flashes of light and thunderous explosions. Kachan's lips are moving, and whilst Izuku can't hear the words over all the noise, he's got that feral grin on his face and his eyes are bright in the midst of battle. He's holding his own. A familiar yell rises above the din, and Izuku's head snaps toward it, feet already moving, fear freezing the blood in his veins. "Todoroki-kun!" he shouts, full cowl coursing through him as he charges into the fray. Through the haze of the smoke caused by Todoroki's fire and Kachan's explosions, it takes Izuku a moment to spot Todoroki, propped up by a wall of ice and pressing his palm to his temple. His left hand sweeps out, and a burst of flames is pushing the villains back. "Todoroki-kun!" Izuku skids to a stop so suddenly that he nearly slips on the thin sheet of ice below his feet. He manages to maintain his balance, grabbing Todoroki's shoulders. Izuku's gaze locks onto the blood weeping down the side of Todoroki's face, from where his right hand is clasped. "Are you all right?" Todoroki's gaze flickers down to Izuku's, just a split second of eye contact, then back up toward the villains, eyes narrowing. He stomps down with his right foot, and the ice beneath their feet swells and bursting up into jagged spikes behind Izuku. Todoroki exhales a shaky cloud of steam through his gritted teeth, brows pulling together in a wince. His white bangs are matted with red, enough red to make Izuku's stomach drop. "Head wounds bleed a lot. It's not as bad as it looks," Todoroki says firmly. Izuku sucks in a breath, taking a step back to give him space. Are you—" "I'm okay, Midoriya." He reaches down with his unoccupied left hand and unclasps one of the capsules, hanging off his utility belt, shoving it into Izuku's hand. "Here, patch me up. I'll cover you. Just try to make it quick." "Right." Izuku nods, hastily unscrewing the capsule and pulling out the tightly packed gauze and medical wrap. Discarding the empty canister, he brushes Todoroki's bangs out of the way, gently coaxing his hand away from the wound. Without the pressure from his hand, the cut quickly vanishes beneath a rush of blood, and Izuku brings his arm up, using his sleeve to wipe it away as carefully as he can, desperate to get a look at the injury. The tension in his shoulders drops just a bit at the sight. The cut, despite the amount of blood it's producing, is clean and shallow, probably not even bad enough to warrant any stitches. More blood wells up and spills down Todoroki's cheek, prompting Izuku into action. He wipes away what blood he can, then presses a thick patch of gauze over the cut, murmuring an apology when Todoroki winces. He secures the gauze in place by looping the medical wrap around Todoroki's head as tightly as he dares. Not a moment later, Todoroki's jerking to the side, bloody right palm flying out and launching a burst of ice. "The villain in the white shirt," Todoroki says quickly. "His quirk. It has something to do with accuracy, similar to Snipe's." "Did you get a hold of Aizawa-sensei?" Izuku asks, shifting to stand by Todoroki's side. "Yes. Did you alert the police?" Todoroki said, and his shoulders relax at Izuku's affirming nod. "Good. Aizawa said that we need to hold off until he can get here, since there's no pro-agencies in the city. He's still chasing down the rest of the villains that ran." This doesn't come as a surprise. Aizawa had explained on the train that Kaminobe City's population had been on a steady decline for years, and in turn so has villain activity. This particular patrol was meant to have been more of a break than performing any actual hero work. They weren't supposed to walk into the middle of a black market weapons trade in an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. If Izuku didn't know any better, he'd genuinely consider the idea that the whole of Class 1A is somehow under the influence of a bad luck quirk. Still, he is grateful that this section of the city seems to have no actual civilians to worry about. Izuku watches closely as the two villains scramble over Todoroki's latest ice formation. "What about her?" he asks, looking toward the woman with the electric blue hair and opaque glasses. "What's her quirk?" "Not sure," Todoroki admits. "I haven't seen her do anything yet." Izuku bites his lip, takes a brief moment to think over all the possible options. "Okay, I've got a plan. What happened to your arm?" Todoroki cuts in, and Izuku looks down at his left bicep, where his costume is split and stained with a spreading patch of red. "Oh, right. Don't worry about it," Izuku dismisses. Then, more insistently, "I have a plan." Todoroki frowns, but he doesn't protest, so Izuku continues. "I'm going to take on the villain in white," he says. "I should be able to take him at close range. You stay back and keep up with the long-range attacks on the villain with the glasses, since we don't know her quirk and it'll be safer to keep our distance." Todoroki hesitates, eyes darting between Izuku's arm and the villain's. Finally, he relents. "Okay." He agrees, voice gruff with reluctance. "Just be careful." Izuku nods, turning and narrowing his eyes at the enemies. "You think you can separate them?" Todoroki doesn't respond, but he does send off a jet of fire from his left hand, and the two villains spring apart, cursing. Izuku turns to Todoroki and beams at him, then activates full cowl and bolts forward. The white shirt villain's eyes go wide in surprise, clearly not expecting Izuku's sudden change to an offensive attack. Using that to his advantage, Izuku aims for the villain's jaw with a balled-up fist. The villain brings up his arms and absorbs the blow, feet skidding backward on the ice from the force of it. Izuku follows, giving the villain no time to recover before swinging out his right leg. It connects with the villain's shins and sweeps him right off his feet. The momentum causes the villain's head to slam against the ground with a nasty-sounding crack, and Izuku winces sympathetically. That had to hurt, he thinks, and he nudges the villain's leg with the toe of his sneaker. He's out cold. The police should be here any minute. Once they do... His train of thought is abruptly cut off when a blast of cold air whips past his left ear, frost clinging to his cheek from just how close it is. Izuku's heart leaps, and he jerks his head away, already craning his neck to look at the source. "Careful, Todoroki," he says with a breathless laugh. Eyes a little wide. It was close. He's never known Todoroki to be quite so risky with his attacks. It had to have been an accident, surely. Orange flames surge toward him in an intense wave of heat, and the shock of it freezes him in place, staring dumbly at the onslaught of fire. "Deku!" A solid mass rams into him, hard enough to send him sprawling. Before he can get his bearings, mind still blue-screening like a malfunctioning computer, he's being hauled upright and dragged behind the cover of a parked car. "What the fuck?" Kachan snarls. He snaps his fingers in Izuku's face to get his attention. "Hey, idiot, why the hell is Icy Hot aiming for you?" Izuku blinks up at him, thoughts finally rushing back as his brain catches up with the situation. The fear that washes over him leaves him cold and breathless. His voice is small. I don't know." Kachan scowls, but Izuku can tell by the tightness in his shoulders that he too is shaken by the unprecedented turn of events. What is going on? Why would Todoroki attack me? And so suddenly it was out of nowhere. Oh! Realization strikes Izuku hard, like a slap across the face. "Kachan! Move!" Kachan yells, and his grip is firm around Izuku's wrist as he yanks him away from the car. Just in time, too, because a moment later the entire vehicle is encased in ice. Kachan fires off a series of explosions, propelling them further away from the attacks while also providing them a veil of smoke as cover. Gaze darting across the area, Izuku activates full cal and grabs Kachan, hauling him into a narrow alley between the two buildings. They duck behind a dumpster, and Izuku meets Kachan's sharp, glaring eyes. Kachan demands, "Explain. Now." Izuku's voice is a rapid, hushed whisper as words spill from his mouth. "The last villain. We didn't see her quirk, so I told Todoroki to take care of her because his attacks are long-range." Kachan finishes. "Shit, you think the villain's quirk is controlling him?" "It's the only thing that makes sense, Kachan." "Okay, then how?" Kachan huffs. "Think the villain managed to touch him? Or maybe she asked him something, like that mind control kid that just transferred to our class?" "His name is Shinso," Izuku says. Then he shakes his head. "No, there's no way. These villains aren't that good, and Todoroki was right by me. If she said something, I'd have heard it." "So what, then?" Kachan hisses. "I can't take this bitch out if—" "I have a hunch." Izuku cuts in, distant eyes locked on the ground. "The villain. She's wearing these glasses. They almost look like sunglasses. You can't see through them, and taking everything else into consideration, it only makes sense if—" "God damn it, Deku, what?" "Eye contact," Izuku says, quickly looking up. "I'm pretty sure." Kachan exhales sharply. "Okay," he says, then more firmly. "Okay, here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna go find this chick. Icy Hot's the only one attacking, so she's gotta be hiding, which means that she's either too much of a coward to fight or too weak for combat. You need to play distraction to half and half until I can get to the bitch. Try to snap him out of it if you can." Izuku catches on to the strategy immediately. With full cal, he's faster than Kachan, allowing him easier evasion, and One for All will do less damage than Kachan's explosions if he has to defend himself against Todoroki. It'll be easier to avoid hurting him. "Okay," he nods with a small smile. "That's a good plan, Kachan." "Just shut up and do it," Kachan snaps, and he leaps out from behind their cover of the alleyway. Izuku scrambles to follow. As soon as he steps out onto the street, Izuku has to dive out of the way to avoid a wall of jagged ice. He quickly regains his footing, his fists clenched by his sides as he raises his head. His eyes meet Todoroki's, and his stomach drops at the blank, emotionless slate of his face. Yeah, he's definitely being controlled, Izuku thinks grimly, because he knows that look. He'd seen it on his own face when he rewatched the sports festival footage. "Todoroki!" he calls out, to keep the attacks focused on himself instead of Kachan, but really, the effort is pointless. Todoroki hadn't even spared a glance toward Kachan, and while that may be a relief, it's also mildly alarming because it means all of Todoroki's power is going to be directed at him, and only him. Maybe if I talk enough, it'll snap him out of it. "Todoroki, listen!" Izuku's breath catches, and he cuts himself off as he dodges another burst of ice. Still, he persists. "This isn't you. Come on, fight this. I know you can." That dead look on Todoroki's face doesn't change. "Okay, new plan. I'll do a lot better in close combat, plus, with Shinso it takes physical contact to break out of his control. That's it. I just need to get close enough to touch him." Izuku steels himself, feels the pulsing energy of full cal shoot down through his legs, and he launches himself forward in a bounding sprint. His long strides eat up the distance between them, and Izuku's just bracing himself to slam into Todoroki when he sees him bring up his right hand, palm facing out. Izuku grits his teeth and slows down, muscles in his right leg tensing, ready to smash through Todoroki's impending wall of ice with a kick. But he doesn't make a wall of ice. Instead, to Izuku's utter surprise, Todoroki shoots several rapid-fire ice daggers out of his palm. The move is so unexpected, since when can he do that, holy shit, that Izuku falters just for a moment. But that fraction of hesitation is enough, and Izuku leaps aside too late to avoid all the projectiles. He stumbles back a step, hissing at the sudden, throbbing sting in his side and shoulder. He quickly looks over all the injuries with flitting, trained eyes, and he's relieved to note that the daggers aren't that big. Surely nothing fatal. In fact, the ice is already soothing the ache of the wounds. Gotta keep trying. If he tries that move again, I'll be ready for it this time. I shouldn't have let my guard down. Bracing himself, Izuku rushes forward once more, and he's close enough now that he lands a solid kick to Todoroki's stomach, though only using 5% power, before Todoroki can launch another attack. Todoroki skids back from the force of the blow, but he's unfazed, face still as expressionless as before as he shoots the burst of fire from his palm. Izuku rolls under the jet of flames, finding temporary cover behind another car. The contact didn't work. Why didn't it work? Izuku thinks, a seed of panic blooming in his stomach. All quirks have some sort of drawback. Maybe it's a ranged quirk, but the villain shouldn't be able to maintain control if she ran. Izuku's head snaps up, eyes narrowing against the thin screen of smoke as he scans the buildings across the road. He catches a flash of bright blue and quickly looks away, launching himself in the direction of Kachan's angry yelling. "Kachan!" he shouts, flinging his arm to point toward the building. "Second floor, 2 windows to the left." He doesn't get a verbal response, but in the next second, he hears Kachan's explosions moving toward the building in question, and the panicked lump forming in his throat isn't nearly as suffocating. Now all he has to do is hold Todoroki off until Kachan can subdue the villain. So he dodges and evades, snapping flames and shards of ice slicing toward him. Despite being wholly under Todoroki's focus and attacks, he manages to get in close, behind Todoroki. He wraps his arms around him, pinning his arms to his sides. Todoroki thrashes, but otherwise he remains silent, and the sudden lull in sound, minus the scuffing of Todoroki's feet against the asphalt and Kachan's distant explosions, is unnerving. "Stop," Izuku whispers, mouth and nose pressed into the collar of Todoroki's hero costume. "Shoto, stop." Todoroki flails for another moment, then stops, and Izuku feels the sudden tension buzzing under Todoroki's skin, buries his face between Todoroki's shoulder blades because he knows. He knows the amount of power that Todoroki's about to unleash. Thick, heavy ice wraps around Izuku's right arm, starting at his wrist and climbing up his arm, up to his shoulder, creeping toward his neck. Before he can think, or even begin to panic, he's choking out a gasp at the sudden, burning pain spanning across the inside of his left forearm and spreading, climbing up, up, up. The instinct to release Todoroki to shove himself away from the pain is almost overwhelming. So he holds him tighter, muffling a sob into Todoroki's back, practically smothering himself. Then, miraculously, Todoroki goes completely still. The ice crawling up his neck comes to a halt, and the flames searing up his skin vanish, replaced with throbbing, sticky, crashing waves of pain that shoot up his arm and rattle his teeth. It's quiet. So quiet. Izuku holds his breath, preparing himself for another bout of struggling, but... "Midoriya?" Todoroki's voice is soft, confused. The air in Izuku's lungs shudders out of him, and his grip around Todoroki's chest goes slack. He leans his forehead against Todoroki's back, shaking. He doesn't speak, doesn't think he can past the tightness of his throat. His arm hurts. It's a different type of pain than broken bones. It's worse somehow. Vaguely he registers Todoroki melting the ice off of him, steam billowing upward and whisking away on a slight breeze. The air smells faintly of cooking meat, and Izuku's stomach rolls when he notices it. Izuku steels himself and quickly pulls his arm away from where it is flush against Todoroki's own arm and torso. The movement sears like agony across his arm, surprising enough to make him suck in a sharp, pained breath. Todoroki stiffens, his voice unusually sharp with concern as he says, "Midoriya." He starts to turn his head, and Izuku panics, bringing his injured arm behind his back. "Don't!" He snaps through gritted teeth. He forces his jaw to loosen, doesn't like how harsh he sounds. His voice is much softer, but trembling as he says, pleading. Don't look." He shuffles back, makes himself take deep, even breaths that flutter in his lungs. He moves to step away from Todoroki to put some space between them so Todoroki can turn around, but the graze of air across his skin brings black bursts to his vision. He's lightheaded, and his chest feels weird, like he's breathing helium instead of oxygen. Still, he tucks his arm behind his back, angling his body so Todoroki can't see. "Hey, what the hell?" Kachan's voice cuts off abruptly as Izuku's trembling legs refuse to support him any longer, and he falls to his knees. He hears Todoroki's alarmed call of his name, his footsteps rushing closer. Another burst of panic, and despite how badly it'll hurt, Izuku pulls his burned arm up to his chest and presses it there, curling over himself to hide the damage. It hurts. He heaves just once, gritting his teeth so hard that they ache. He presses his forehead against the asphalt, eyes closing, swallowing down the bile that creeps up his throat like fire. Fire. Deep breaths, he staves off the urge to vomit, throat tight and aching. Tears mingle with the dirt and blood and soot on his face. He breaks out into a cold sweat. A hand comes to rest on his back, and he works his jaw, inhaling slow through his nose. "I'm fine," he breathes. "I'm fine." "You're not," Kachan says, but his voice lacks its usual sharpness. That's how Izuku knows that it's bad. Todoroki is silent. Izuku can't see him, but Todoroki is his friend. He knows him well enough to feel the waves of guilt pouring off of him. So Izuku keeps his eyes closed, reaching out blindly with his right hand until he finds Todoroki's. He tries to pull his hand back, but Izuku grasps it tightly, slips his fingers between Todoroki's, and squeezes hard enough that it probably hurts. He doesn't know whether it's his hands or Todoroki's that are trembling. "It's not your fault," Izuku says. He lifts his head slowly, but remains curled over himself because Todoroki cannot see it. He can't. Izuku refuses to let him. His vision swims a bit, then focuses. Todoroki's crouched beside him, staring at the ground. but the look on his face is unlike anything Izuku's seen before. Todoroki looks devastated, and seeing that hurts Izuku more than anything else. Because his arm hurts. It burns, but no amount of physical pain could ever compare to the pain of seeing that look on Todoroki's face, that lost, despairing, haunted look. "Shoto," Izuku says, firm but quiet, voice uncharacteristically serious. "Look at me." Todoroki's gaze flicks up, eyes wild with distress and brimming with tears. Izuku squeezes his hand tightly, gives him his most reassuring smile. "I'm okay." Somehow, Todoroki's expression seems to crumble even further at that. Aizawa-sensei arrives shortly before the police and the ambulance do. He rushes over and demands to know what happened. His immediate priority is, of course, Izuku, considering that he's on the ground and clearly injured. Kacchan has to be the one to explain, taking into account Izuku's general discomfort and Todoroki's distant silence. Aizawa's aura of calm, despite the tightness at the corner of his eyes indicating otherwise, it helps. While Izuku is still hurting and Aizawa-sensei can't really help that, he's an adult. He's their teacher. Just his presence is enough to ease the tension of Izuku's shoulders. Curled over himself the way that he is, the EMTs initially think that it's his stomach that's the problem. It takes Kacchan's aggressive, clipped explanation to smooth things out, and even then Izuku refuses to let them pull him up and onto the stretcher until Aizawa-sensei leads Todoroki away to gather and restrain the unconscious villains. Kacchan climbs into the back of the ambulance without permission, though he isn't stopped from doing so. The medical technician gently pulls Izuku's arm from his chest, straightening it out to examine the injury. Izuku fixes his gaze on the ceiling of the ambulance and refuses to look. Kacchan does, though. Izuku knows this because he hears him suck a breath through his teeth, something strangled and choked with horror. Izuku blinks up at the ceiling, fists his right hand into the material of his costume, and doesn't look. Izuku's only in the hospital for 3 days. Thanks to a special visit from Recovery Girl, it's also thanks to her that he regains full mobility and feeling of his arm, and he's only left with some mild scarring, which she repeatedly reminds him was unlikely and incredibly lucky. It barely even hurts, only the occasional sharp pain or tingling making itself known. Izuku's mom doesn't leave once during Izuku's entire hospital stay, neither does Kacchan. Every single one of his classmates comes to check on him, usually in groups, and even Aizawa-sensei drops by. Everyone visits, except Todoroki. After doing one last check of his vitals and rewrapping his arm, Izuku's released just after lunchtime on Saturday. He and his mom get a ride back to the apartment complex, courtesy of UA, and Izuku spends the remainder of the day at home, Mom hovering over him like he's 14 again and making katsudon for dinner. It's comforting, though, and Izuku doesn't realize just how much he missed his mom while living at the dorms. The next morning he asks if he can go back to UA. Mom is hesitant, waffling, and twisting her hands together as she frets, and it's only Izuku's promises of staying on campus and to call her if he needs anything that gets her to relent. He loves her more than anything, and he understands her worry, but Todoroki's his friend, and he hasn't replied to any of Izuku's texts since the second day in the hospital. Every hour that passes without talking to him adds to the ball of dread in his stomach. He doesn't leave first thing in the morning. He stays home long enough to have lunch with his mom and catch her up a bit on his most recent classes, and he's glad for it. He really did miss her. Izuku arrives back at Heights Alliance at about 3 in the afternoon with nothing but the clothes on his back. His uniform and school things are all in his dorm, and his hero costume was, once again, shipped off to the support department for repairs. Briefly, he wonders if Hatsume will add any new upgrades. "Hey, Midoriya, you're back!" Kirishima's voice is slightly breathless, but he's grinning as he jogs over. His hair is pushed back by a sweatband, and his water bottle sloshes in his hand. "Of course he's back, idiot!" Kacchan snaps, but he, too, is short of breath. "You two went for a run," Izuku says, and Kirishima nods. "Yeah, man. Mina kept bugging Bakubro about wanting to finally see his room, so he asked if I'd run with him to blow off some steam," Kirishima explains, and his grin doesn't falter even if Kacchan shoves him so hard that he stumbles. "Shut up, shitty hair," he grumbles. "Consider yourself grateful I even invited you." Kirishima beams. "Oi, Deku, you coming in or are you just going to stand outside all damn day?" Izuku decides not to point out that he's only been there for a few minutes, and he follows the other two back into the dorms. Immediately he's pounced upon by his classmates, who drag him into the common room to join whatever appears to be another rerun of the sports festival. Most of the classes there, even Shinso and Tokiyami, two of the most reclusive members of their class. A quick head count reveals no sign of familiar red and white hair. "He hasn't come out of his dorm since he and Sensei got back." "Kaminari-kun," Izuku says, and he turns just in time to catch a flash of yellow as Kaminari slings an arm around his shoulders. Kaminari glances over at the sofas, then tugs Izuku toward the elevator. As soon as the doors close, Kaminari heaves a sigh, pulling his arm away from Izuku and leaning against the wall. You were looking for Sho, right? At Izuku's affirming nod, Kaminari continues. When you and Bakugo went to the hospital, the police detained the villains and took Todoroki in for questioning. I'm just glad that Aizawa-sensei was there. Apparently the police were coming down pretty hard on Roki, giving him the 3rd degree, and it pissed Sensei off, so after like an hour, he cut the questioning short and brought him back here. He glances to the side. We left him alone the first couple of days. Sensei said that he was given permission to miss class and to give him space, and Bakugo kept threatening to kill us if we messed with him, but it's been like almost 4 days, and he hasn't come out of his room. He's ignoring everyone's texts and his door is locked. Tokiyami said he saw him sneaking downstairs the other day for food, but it's just not healthy. Idly, Kaminari presses the elevator button for the 5th floor. He fiddles with his hair tie on his wrist. Me, Ochako, and Eijiro plan to tell Aizawa-sensei about it tomorrow morning, if he still hadn't come out. It's just, we're worried, you know. Do you think that he'll talk to me? Izuku asks, absent-mindedly pulling at the sleeves of his hoodie. The thought of Todoroki locking himself in his room away from everyone, refusing to talk to his friends or even come out for meals, it creates a ball of unease that settles in the pit of his stomach. Man, I sure hope so, Kaminari mumbles. The elevator dings quietly as it stops, a small lull before the door slides open. Kaminari gestures forward. If you need anything, text me, or Eijiro, or hell, any of us. He pauses, more serious than Izuku's ever seen him. Seriously, dude. That goes for both of you. Then he grins, steering Izuku out of the elevator, with a hand on his shoulder. Just before the door closes again, Kaminari aims 2 finger guns at him, coupled with a cheeky wink. Then the door seals and begins its descent back to the 1st floor, and Izuku's left alone. After a moment, just a moment of contemplation, he turns on his heel and makes his way toward the room that he's only been in a handful of times. The door is shut just like the rest of the doors in the hall, so inconspicuous that Izuku has to double-check the room number and the nameplate before he's certain that he stopped at the right one. He considers calling out, but he decides at the last second to knock instead. After a much too long suspension of time, the door cracks open. Todoroki's eyes, barely visible, widen just slightly when they meet Izuku's, and it's only Izuku's quick reflex of jamming his foot in the door that prevents Todoroki from shutting it in his face. Without a word, Izuku pushes himself inside, and Todoroki, not without reluctance, lets him. Izuku scans the room, and he's once again unsettled by just how normal it looks. He falters for a second, then makes his way over to the bed to sit, patting the empty space beside him. When Todoroki finally moves to sit, he's stiff and tense, arm pressed against Izuku's. Hey, Izuku wavers. He clears his throat and pushes forward. Listen, we don't have to talk about it, if you don't want to, but we're here for you. Everyone in the classes, including me. He turns and pulls Todoroki into an unceremonious hug, gripping him hard despite Todoroki's stiffness. It takes several seconds, but even after the tension drains from Todoroki's shoulders, his hands hover. You're not going to hurt me, you know, Izuku says quietly, voice muffled in Todoroki's shoulder. You could never hurt me, Shoto. And Todoroki breaks. He presses his face down into Izuku's hair and allows shaking hands to settle on Izuku's back, arms secured around him like he's something precious. But I did, Todoroki whispers, voice trembling. I did hurt you. Izuku shakes his head lightly, breath puffing against Todoroki's collarbone. No, you didn't. That wasn't you, not really. You didn't do anything wrong. He's not entirely sure if Todoroki believes him, but as Todoroki breaks down in silent tears and holds him even tighter, Izuku knows that it's a start. All right, everyone. This concludes the one-shot entitled 3rd Degree. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Let me know your thoughts and reactions, and as always, thank you so much for listening.